My name is Alyssa Rhodes, and I am 27 years old. And 2 years ago, a woman named Marilyn Cross stood in front of my own small group at Grace Community Church and told the room, without using my name directly, that some of us needed to examine whether our closest friendships were actually helping us grow closer to God or quietly pulling us away from Him. 3 weeks ago, that same woman stood in the baptistry at Grace Community and helped lower my closest friend Casey Bennett into the water, the same friend Marilyn had once warned me was going to ruin my witness. I want to tell you about the 2 years in between, because I know some of you have been made to feel like your own church family was suspicious of a friendship that never once threatened your faith at all, and I do not think we hear enough about how a story like that can actually end. Before I go any further, I want you to remember one small thing for me, because it comes back later, and I promise I will return to it. On the porch of my own house, there are 2 coffee mugs that live there permanently. Mine with a small cross painted on the side, Casey's plain white, both left out in all weather because neither one of us has ever once remembered to bring them inside after our Sunday morning coffee. Hold on to those 2 mugs. They matter more than you would think. If you have ever been made to feel suspicious inside your own church for loving someone who does not yet believe, this one is for you. Go ahead and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Wednesday evening 2 years ago, and to the exact moment I understood what the next 2 years at my own church were going to cost me. I grew up at Grace Community Church here in Richmond, Virginia, a mid-sized non-denominational congregation my parents joined the year I was born, the kind of church where you know most of the names in the directory, and where the same handful of families have led the same handful of ministries for decades. My father served as a deacon there for over 15 years, my mother led the children's ministry, and I grew up understanding church not as a building I visited on Sundays, but as the actual center of my week. Small group on Wednesdays, serving on the hospitality team most Sunday mornings, a life woven so thoroughly into that particular congregation that I genuinely could not picture my own identity apart from it. Grace Community meets in a plain brick building off a quiet street in the West End, a sanctuary that seats around 300, a fellowship hall that has hosted every significant event of my entire life, my own baby dedication, my confirmation, more potlucks than I could possibly count. I have sat in nearly the same pew my entire life, third from the front on the left side, and I have watched the same families raise children who are now raising their own, a continuity that had always felt, before any of this happened, like the safest, steadiest thing I had. The women's ministry at Grace Community meets every Wednesday evening in the same fellowship hall where I once attended vacation Bible school as a girl, folding tables arranged in a loose circle, a coffee urn that has been replaced twice in my lifetime, but always seems to produce exactly the same slightly burnt taste. And Marilyn has led that particular gathering with real skill and genuine care for over a decade, a fact I want to hold alongside everything else in this story, because it would be too simple to remember her only as the woman who once warned a room about me. I teach second grade at an elementary school here in Richmond, a job I have held for going on 5 years now, and it was there, during my second year teaching, that I met Casey Bennett, a fourth grade teacher 2 doors down the hallway, sharp, funny, endlessly patient with her own students in a way that made me like her immediately. Casey did not believe in God, not out of any particular anger or rebellion, simply because nobody in her own upbringing had ever given her much reason to. A plain, unbothered agnosticism she held the same way some people hold an opinion about a sports team they do not follow closely enough to argue about. I remember the specific afternoon we actually became friends rather than simply friendly coworkers, both of us staying late grading papers, commiserating over a particularly difficult parent conference we had each separately survived that same week, and I remember laughing harder that afternoon than I had in months, surprised by how easily this woman I barely knew had made an exhausting day feel lighter. Our friendship deepened over that first year, the way most real friendships do, not through any single dramatic moment, but through 100 small ordinary ones, covering each other's recess duty when one of us was sick, celebrating small classroom victories together, driving each other home more than once when a car would not start. By the end of that first year, Casey had become, without either of us planning it, the person I called first with any piece of good or bad news, a status I had previously reserved only for my own family and my closest friends from church. We became close quickly, the particular fast friendship that sometimes happens between two people sharing a hard first year of teaching, trading lesson plans and complaints about the copier, and, eventually, real conversations about our actual lives. I never once hid my own faith from her. I talked about church the same way I talked about my family, plainly, as simply part of who I was, and Casey, to her enormous credit, asked genuine, respectful questions, rather than dismissing any of it, the kind of questions that told me she was actually curious, rather than merely tolerating me. I invited her to Grace Community for the first time about 6 months into our friendship, casually, the way you invite a friend to something that matters to you, without any particular agenda attached. She came, sat through the whole service politely, told me afterward that she had found the music genuinely moving, even though she did not share the beliefs behind it, and thanked me for the invitation without any promise of returning. I did not push her to come back. I simply kept being her friend, at school, over coffee on weekends, at the occasional dinner where our conversations ranged over everything except, most weeks, the specific subject of faith itself. I remember that first visit clearly, watching Casey out of the corner of my eye during the opening worship, curious rather than uncomfortable, and I remember introducing her afterward to a few people in the lobby, including, as it happened, Marilyn herself, who greeted her warmly enough that day, asking polite questions about how she knew me, giving no early sign at all of the tension that would eventually develop. It was around that same season that Marilyn Cross, who has led the women's ministry at Grace Community for over a decade, and who also led my Wednesday night small group, began asking me, pointedly, how things were going with my friend from work. I did not think much of the question at first, answering honestly that things were going wonderfully, that Casey was one of the kindest people I had ever met. I remember the specific way Marilyn's questions began to shift over those first few months, from ordinary curiosity to something with a sharper edge underneath it, asking whether Casey had mentioned any interest in church, whether I had shared my testimony with her directly, whether I felt any tension between spending so much time with someone who did not share my values. I answered each question honestly, without yet understanding that Marilyn was building, slowly, toward a conclusion she had already begun to reach. The Wednesday evening I mentioned at the start of this story came about 8 months into the friendship, during small group, when Marilyn, without using my name, told the room that some of us needed to examine whether our closest friendships were actually helping us grow closer to God, or quietly pulling us away from Him, that a light cannot truly shine while spending most of its time in close fellowship with darkness, and let the sentence sit there a beat too long before moving into that week's lesson. The room went quiet the particular length of time it takes people to decide whether they know exactly who a comment is aimed at. I knew. Everyone in that room knew. Nobody said anything, and neither did I. I remember driving home that evening replaying the sentence over and over, trying to decide whether I had imagined the particular weight in Marilyn's voice when she said close fellowship with darkness, or whether the entire room had heard exactly what I had heard. I did not sleep well that night, lying awake, turning over 8 months of an ordinary good friendship, wondering how something that had brought me nothing but joy had somehow become, in one careful sentence, a spiritual danger I needed to examine. I did not know yet that this same careful, public warning, dressed up as a general spiritual principle, was the exact sentence I would think back to 2 years later, standing beside Marilyn at a baptistry, watching her help lower Casey into water. Neither one of us could have predicted that Wednesday evening. There was another moment, smaller than the small group comment, but which stayed with me nearly as long, that happened perhaps 4 months after that Wednesday evening. Marilyn approached me after a Sunday service and asked, in a tone that sounded genuinely concerned rather than accusatory, whether I had considered inviting Casey to a different kind of gathering entirely, something less central to the church's core community life. a suggestion that on its surface sounded like accommodation, but that I understood, even in the moment, as a polite request to keep my friendship at arm's length from the parts of Grace community that mattered most to Marilyn. I told her, gently, that Casey was welcome anywhere I was welcome, and Marilyn nodded, seemingly unconvinced, and the conversation ended there, though it would be the first of several similar conversations over the following year. The following months, the pressure lived mostly in small, deniable moments rather than large confrontational ones. I was quietly removed from co-leading the following semester's small group study, a role I had held for 2 years, with a vague explanation from Marilyn about wanting to give other women a chance to grow into leadership. Invitations to certain gatherings, a women's retreat, a smaller prayer circle that met monthly, simply stopped arriving, never explained, never acknowledged as anything other than an oversight. I found out about the women's retreat almost by accident, seeing photographs posted afterward by women I considered close friends. A weekend at a lake house 2 hours outside the city that I had attended every year for the previous 4 years without fail. Nobody had told me it was happening that particular year. I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time that evening, scrolling through smiling photographs of women I loved, trying to decide whether the omission had been deliberate or simply an oversight, and ultimately deciding it did not matter which, since either way I had been left out of something that had once felt like mine. I want to be specific about how this particular exclusion actually functioned, because I think the mechanism matters. Marilyn never once told me directly that my friendship with Casey was the reason for any of these changes. Everything arrived wrapped in some other reasonable-sounding explanation: a scheduling conflict, a desire to develop new leadership, a retreat that had simply filled up before my registration came in, the kind of thing that would sound, if I ever tried to name it as exclusion out loud, like I was reading too much into a series of unrelated coincidences. There was a specific incident about a year into the friendship that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that stretch, and I want to tell it to you exactly the way it happened, because it is the moment that told me plainly what those 2 years were going to cost me. I mentioned, in an ordinary conversation after a Sunday service, that Casey had helped me move apartments the previous weekend, driving 2 hours each way with a truck she borrowed from her own brother, refusing any payment for gas. A woman named Deborah, standing nearby, said brightly, "Well, isn't that nice? It's always good when the Lord uses even people outside the faith to bless us," in a tone that managed to compliment Casey's kindness while simultaneously reducing her to a tool rather than a person, and I stood there, smiling, saying nothing, because I did not yet know how to correct something that specific and that public without making an already uncomfortable moment worse. I drove home that afternoon replaying Deborah's exact wording, "The Lord uses even people outside the faith," a phrase that managed to praise Casey's generosity while quietly filing her under a category, rather than treating her as a friend I genuinely loved. I remember wishing, the whole drive home, that I had found the words to correct it in the moment, rather than simply smiling and letting it pass. And I remember deciding, that same afternoon, that the next time something like it happened, I would not let it pass so easily. If you have ever had your own church family treat your closest friendship like a spiritual liability rather than a genuine gift, I want you to know I understand exactly how lonely that particular suspicion can feel. Stay with me, because there is a turn coming, and if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss where this one lands. I want to tell you honestly about the season, sometime in our 2nd year of friendship, where I very nearly stopped attending Grace Community altogether, because I do not think it is fair to leave that part out. It was after a particularly hard month where 3 separate women had each, in their own careful way, asked me whether I had considered that my friendship with Casey might be a spiritual weight I was carrying, rather than a blessing I was receiving, and I drove to my own mother's house afterward, and sat at her kitchen table, and told her I was tired, clean through, of defending a friendship that had never once asked me to compromise a single thing about what I believed. I remember that particular evening clearly, sitting at the same table where I had done homework as a girl, my mother listening with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had made, without asking whether I wanted any, simply knowing, the way mothers do, that I needed something warm to hold on to, more than I needed an actual answer to any question. I told her about all three conversations, each one delivered kindly, each one carrying the same underlying suspicion, and I told her I no longer knew whether I was the one misreading the situation or whether an entire small group had genuinely decided my closest friendship was a problem to be solved. My mother let me finish before she said anything, which she has always been better at than I am. Then she told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Alyssa, I am not going to tell you the tension is easy, and I am not going to tell you it does not cost you something real, because it does. But I want you to ask yourself something, before you decide anything about this friendship, based on what these particular women are saying. Has Casey ever once asked you to believe less? Or has she simply asked you to keep showing up as her friend, the same way you would for anyone else you loved?" I told her, honestly, that Casey had never once asked me to change a single thing about my own faith, that if anything, she had asked more genuine questions about it than most people inside my own church ever had. My mother said, "Then I think the person doing the pulling in this story is not the one everyone at your small group seems to think it is." I called my own sister too, that same difficult season, mostly to vent rather than to seek any particular wisdom, and I remember her telling me something I did not expect. She said, "Alyssa, has it occurred to you that Marilyn might actually be afraid of something closer to home, not really about Casey specifically, but about whether her own daughter, who left the faith entirely in college, might have stayed closer to it if someone in her life had modeled exactly the kind of patient, unhurried friendship you are modeling for Casey right now?" I did not know, at the time, whether that theory held any truth to it, though I have thought of it often since, especially once I learned, much later, some of the private grief Marilyn herself carried around her own daughter's distance from the church. My sister has never once met Marilyn, and I have always found it slightly remarkable that she guessed at the underlying wound so precisely from nothing more than my own frustrated retelling of a handful of pointed comments. I asked her, later, how she had arrived at that particular theory, and she told me, simply, that fear this specific and this consistent almost never comes from nowhere, that people rarely guard against a danger they have not already been burned by once themselves. I did not always carry that season gracefully. There were evenings I came home from church and cried harder than I let anyone at Grace Community know. Evenings I genuinely considered finding a quieter congregation, one where nobody would ever question a friendship that had cost me nothing but given me so much. I want you to know that thought crossed my mind seriously more than once, and I am not proud of how close I came to acting on it purely to make my own Sundays simpler. There was one particular week, near the end of our first year of friendship, where I genuinely wondered whether I had somehow imagined the whole pattern, whether 2 years of careful comments were actually a story I had built around a handful of misunderstandings that meant less than I believed they did. I mentioned this to Casey herself, of all people, one evening over dinner, half expecting her to reassure me that I was overreacting, and instead she told me, plainly, that she had noticed the coolness herself, more than once, at the 2 or 3 services she had attended, women who greeted her politely but never warmly, and that she had wondered, silently, whether her presence was somehow the reason. I remember feeling a strange mixture of vindication and grief hearing her say that. Vindication that I had not imagined any of it. Grief that my own church's suspicion had been visible even to the very person it was aimed at protecting me from. Casey told me, that same dinner, that she had almost mentioned it to me sooner, but had not wanted to add to whatever pressure she suspected I was already carrying on her behalf. A kindness on her part that I did not fully appreciate until much later, once I understood how much she herself had been quietly absorbing during those early visits. What kept me from actually doing it, in the end, was a conversation with my own pastor, one I had not planned to have, that happened almost by accident during a hallway conversation about an unrelated volunteer matter. I mentioned, near the end of that conversation, that things had felt tense in my small group lately, and he asked, gently, whether I wanted to talk about it. I found myself telling him nearly the whole 2 years in the span of about 20 minutes, more than I had told almost anyone outside my own family. Pastor Reeves listened without interrupting, the same patient way he has counseled families through every kind of crisis for over 20 years at Grace Community. And when I finished, he sat quietly for a moment before answering. The particular thoughtful pause I have come to associate with him taking a question seriously, rather than reaching for a ready-made response. He told me that Scripture's warning about being unequally yoked was written specifically about marriage, a permanent binding covenant, and had never once been intended as a blanket prohibition on ordinary friendship with people who do not yet believe. That Jesus himself was regularly criticized by the religious leaders of his own day for spending time with exactly the kind of people his own community considered spiritually risky to associate with. He said, "Alyssa, I think some of the women in your group have taken a verse meant to protect something permanent and applied it to something meant to be a bridge rather than a risk, and I do not think you are the one who has misread Scripture in this particular situation." He reminded me that same afternoon of the specific accusation leveled against Jesus by the religious leaders of his own time, that he ate with tax collectors and sinners, an accusation meant as condemnation that Scripture itself records without any hint of shame attached to it. He told me he had always found it striking that the very behavior meant to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the religious establishment was, in fact, the exact behavior Scripture holds up as evidence of who Jesus actually was, and that he did not think the modern church had fully learned that particular lesson even 2,000 years later. I asked him, before I left his office that afternoon, whether he thought I should say something directly to Marilyn, confront her plainly about how her comments had actually landed. He told me confrontation was not off the table entirely, but that he sensed, from what I had described, that Marilyn's own fear ran deeper than a single conversation was likely to reach, and that my own particular calling in this specific situation seemed to him to be patience rather than direct correction. I did not fully agree with him in the moment, though I have come to believe he read the situation more accurately than I was capable of at the time. I sat with that for a long while, and decided he was right, and kept my friendship with Casey exactly the way it had always been. Honest, unhurried, entirely without an agenda, without ever once letting the pressure from my own small group shape how I loved her. Here is what those 2 years actually looked like from the inside, and I want to tell you honestly, because I do not think it is fair to make it sound tidier than it was. I never once argued theology with Marilyn or Deborah or any of the other women who grew cold toward me, never quoted Scripture at them to defend myself, never once tried to convince the room that my friendship was acceptable. I simply kept showing up at Grace Community every week I was able, kept serving on the hospitality team even after I was quietly removed from small group leadership, and kept being Casey's friend exactly the same way I always had, without ever once treating her as a project or a soul I needed to strategically win, rather than a person I genuinely loved. There was a particular rhythm to those 2 years that I only recognized once they were behind me. I prayed for Marilyn and Deborah both, by name, most mornings, not because I felt some sudden burst of warmth toward the coldness they had shown me, but because I had been taught my whole life that the hardest people to pray for are usually the ones you are most tempted to simply write off, and I decided, privately, to test whether that teaching actually held up under real pressure inside my own church family, rather than simply out in the world where it felt easier to apply. I kept up my ordinary morning devotions the entire 2 years, a short passage read with coffee going cold beside me, a habit that had nothing dramatic about it, built long before any of this pressure began and continued, unremarkably, straight through the hardest of it. I want to tell you honestly that none of it felt impressive in the moment. It simply felt like the shape my mornings had always taken, and I did not see any reason those 2 difficult years should be the ones to break a habit that had held steady through every other season of my life. I asked my own pastor once, during that same stretch, whether he thought the tension in my small group would ever fully resolve, and he told me he did not know, and that not knowing was not actually the same thing as hopelessness, only honesty, and that faithfulness was mostly a matter of continuing to show up in that same room every Wednesday, even when you were not certain the room would ever fully welcome you back. I did not always live up to the grace that decision asked of me. There were Sundays I sat in the back specifically to avoid a conversation I did not have the energy for, Mornings, my prayer for Marilyn amounted to little more than God, help me not to resent her today, which I have come to believe counts as a real prayer even when it does not sound like one. I am not going to pretend those 2 years turned me into some tireless saint. What I can tell you is that I kept showing up the following Sunday anyway, which is a smaller, more ordinary kind of faithfulness than this story might make it sound, and which turned out to be the only kind that actually holds. If you have ever had to keep showing up somewhere you felt quietly suspected, without ever fully understanding why you kept choosing to stay, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and I think more of us are standing in that exact kind of exhausted faithfulness than anybody around us ever realizes. There was one woman in my small group, a quiet older member named Ruth Ann, who had never once joined in the pointed comments, who became one of the gentler voices in this whole story long before anyone else was ready to hear her. She told me, privately, more than once over those 2 years, that she found my steadiness with Casey genuinely admirable, and that she had told Marilyn directly, on at least one occasion I know of, that she thought the group's treatment of me had gone further than any of them realized. Marilyn never fully took Ruth Ann's warning to heart. Not for a long while, but I noticed the sharper comments softened slightly whenever Ruth Ann was in the room, and I have decided that counts for something. Ruth Ann found me alone after small group one evening, near the end of my second year, and told me she had watched Marilyn carry this particular fear about outside friendships for years, long before I ever joined that group, worried even about her own daughter's college roommate, worried, in Ruth Ann's words, about every single friendship that did not look exactly like the tidy Christian community she believed she was responsible for protecting. She said, "Honey, Marilyn is not singling you out specifically. She is terrified of watching this whole group drift toward the world, and she has never quite learned to trust that God can use an ordinary friendship to work in the opposite direction instead." I did not find that fully comforting in the moment, though I have come to believe it was entirely true. Ruth Ann herself had been a member of Grace Community for over 30 years, long enough to remember Marilyn as a young mother rather than the confident ministry leader she had since become, and she told me, that same evening, that she had watched Marilyn's own daughter drift away from church attendance sometime in her college years, a private grief Marilyn rarely discussed openly, though Ruth Ann suspected it explained a great deal of the particular anxiety Marilyn brought to any friendship she could not personally observe up close. Casey's mother, Diane, died suddenly on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the spring of our second year, a heart attack with no warning at all, gone before an ambulance could even arrive. Casey called me from the hospital parking lot, her voice barely functioning, and I left my own classroom in the middle of a lesson, arranged coverage as quickly as I could manage, and drove straight there. I remember the drive clearly, hands tight on the wheel, praying the whole way without fully deciding to, the same plain prayers I have prayed my entire life, asking God to hold Casey together long enough for me to physically arrive and hold her myself. I found her sitting on a curb outside the emergency room entrance, still in the clothes she had taught in that morning, staring at nothing, and I sat down beside her on that curb and simply held her while she shook. This is the moment everything I told you about earlier finally comes back around, so stay with me. Before I show you what happened in the days that followed, I want to ask you something. Has a friend's worst crisis ever ended up being exactly the moment your own faithfulness finally made sense to someone who had spent years watching it from the outside? Tell me in the comments, and hit subscribe if this story has been worth your time so far, because what happens next is the reason I am telling it at all. I did not leave Casey's side for the better part of a week. I helped her make funeral arrangements she had no idea how to make, sat with her at 2 a.m. when the grief finally broke through the numbness of the first few days, and prayed, quietly, beside her more than once, not performing anything, simply the same plain, unremarkable prayers I have prayed my whole life, asking God to hold a woman who did not yet believe he was actually holding her. I remember one particular night, around the third day, sitting on Casey's living room floor at nearly 3 a.m, surrounded by old photographs she had pulled out of a closet, both of us exhausted past the point of proper conversation, and I remember praying over her, quietly, while she cried, not asking permission, simply doing what I have always done in the presence of someone's real pain, and I remember her not once asking me to stop. I remember, too, the particular photographs scattered across that floor: Diane as a young mother, Diane at Casey's own graduation, an entire life laid out in loose piles neither of us had the strength yet to properly sort. Casey told me weeks later that she remembered every one of those quiet prayers, that she had never once felt uncomfortable hearing them, only strangely unexpectedly comforted, and that she could not, in the middle of the worst week of her life, find a single thing performative or strange about a friend who simply kept praying beside her without ever once demanding she believe the same words back. The funeral itself was small, difficult, the particular kind of grief that comes when a death arrives with no warning at all, and I stood beside Casey through the entire service, and at the graveside, when the small crowd had mostly dispersed, she asked me, quietly, whether I thought her mother was somewhere now, whether any of what I believed was actually true, or simply a story people told themselves to survive exactly this kind of mourning. I remember the particular quality of that graveside: a gray morning, the smell of freshly turned earth, a scattering of relatives I had never met standing at a respectful distance, and Casey's question arriving so plainly, without any preamble, that I understood immediately how much courage it had taken her to ask it at all. I told her honestly that I could not prove it to her the way you prove a math problem, but that I believed it with my whole heart, and that I was not going to pretend otherwise, simply to make the moment easier for either of us. She nodded, and did not ask anything further that day, and I let the silence be enough, because I understood, even then, that this was not a moment that needed my argument. It needed my presence. It was nearly a month later, once the sharpest edge of the grief had softened slightly, that Casey asked if she could come to church with me again, not out of politeness this time, but because, she told me, she had spent the entire month since her mother's death turning something over that she could not quite name, and she wanted to sit in that particular room again while she tried to name it. Casey told me, only much later, that she had noticed the coldness from certain women at Grace Community during the handful of services she attended before her mother's death. Polite greetings that never quite became genuine warmth, a particular careful distance she had chalked up, at the time, to simply being new, rather than to anything specifically about her, and that she had nearly stopped attending altogether before her mother's death changed everything, and forced her back into that same sanctuary during a season when she needed something steady, more than she needed to worry about whether every woman in the room genuinely wanted her there. I remember driving her there that particular Sunday, both of us quiet in the car, and I remember her telling me, right before we walked in, that she was not sure what she was looking for, only that she knew, for the first time in her adult life, that she was actually looking for something, rather than simply assuming there was nothing there to find. She came back the following week, and the week after that. It was nearly 3 months before she asked, quietly, after a service, whether I would help her understand what it actually meant to believe the way I did, not as an intellectual exercise, but as something she might actually be ready to choose for herself. I sat with her for over 2 hours that particular afternoon, answering every question honestly, the same patient way my own parents had raised me to answer anyone's honest questions about faith. Marilyn was in the sanctuary the Sunday, nearly a year after Diane's death, that Casey stood at the front during the invitation and asked Pastor Reeves to pray with her. I watched Marilyn's face from across the room, and I watched something in it change, slowly, over the following weeks, as she began to understand exactly which friendship in this story had actually been drawing someone closer to God, rather than pulling anyone away from him. Casey told me, in the weeks leading up to that particular Sunday, that she had spent the better part of a year working through every honest objection she could think of. Questions about suffering, about other religions, about whether her own mother's death made any of this feel like wishful thinking rather than genuine truth, and that she had brought every single one of those questions to Pastor Reeves directly rather than simply deciding on her own. She told me she wanted to be certain, before she ever asked for prayer at that front altar, that she was choosing this because she actually believed it, not because grief had made her desperate for comfort in any form available. I remember one particular conversation, maybe 6 months into her considering faith seriously, where she asked me directly why a God who supposedly loved her mother would have let her die so suddenly, with no warning, no chance for anyone to say a proper goodbye. I did not have a tidy answer for her, and I told her so honestly that I did not believe faith required me to explain away every hard question with a satisfying answer, only to trust the character of God even in the questions I could not fully resolve. She told me later that my willingness to sit in that uncertainty with her, rather than rushing to defend God with an answer that felt too easy, had done more to make the whole thing feel trustworthy than any confident explanation could have. I asked her, once, during that same year, what had finally tipped her from serious consideration into actual decision, and she told me it had not been any single argument or sermon, but the plain, accumulated weight of watching me love her consistently through the entire 2 years, including the 2 years my own church had made that love cost me something real, and that she had come to believe a faith capable of producing that kind of steady, costly love was worth taking seriously on its own terms. She told me, too, that she had specifically thought back to that first careless visit, the one where she noticed the coldness from certain women without understanding why, and that she had found something almost moving in the fact that I had never once let that coldness change how I treated her, even before either of us understood the fuller shape of what was happening around us. It was nearly 2 months after that when Marilyn asked if she could speak with me privately, after a Wednesday small group I had quietly returned to attending, though no longer in any leadership role. She told me, plainly, that she had spent 2 years afraid my friendship with Casey would cost me my own witness, and that she had never once considered that the friendship itself might be the very witness God intended to use, patiently, over years rather than weeks. I remember sitting across from her in the church's empty fellowship hall, folding chairs stacked against one wall, the particular quiet of a building after everyone else has gone home, and I remember Marilyn's voice shaking slightly as she began, a woman I had never once seen anything but composed, sitting across from me now looking genuinely uncertain of herself for the first time in the 2 years I had known her. She said, I stood in this exact room and warned this whole group about friendships that pull us away from the Lord, and I meant it as protection, and I have thought about that Wednesday evening more than almost any other one since, because I watched, with my own eyes, the very friendship I warned against become the reason a grieving woman found her way to the same altar I have knelt at my whole life. I have gone back to that Wednesday evening more times over these past months than I can count, wishing I could simply stand up again and say something entirely different, something that welcomed rather than warned. She said, I removed you from leading this group because I did not trust your judgment, and I am ashamed to say that judgment turned out to be sounder than my own. I am asking you to forgive me, because you kept loving a friend I told you to guard yourself against, and that love has borne fruit I never once expected to witness. I do not know how to give you back the 2 years of leadership I took from you, and I do not know how to give you back the retreats you were quietly left out of, but I can at least tell you plainly, in front of anyone in this church who will listen, that I was wrong, and that I am grateful beyond words that you never once let my wrongness change who you were. She told me too, near the end of that conversation, something I had not expected her to volunteer. She said, I think some part of me has spent 2 years afraid of a friendship I could not control, because my own daughter walked away from this church in college, and I never once found the words or the patience to keep loving her the way you kept loving Casey, and I let that guilt turn into fear about every friendship I could not personally supervise. I did not know what to say to that, and I simply reached across the table and held her hand, and she let me, and we sat together for a long while in that particular silence that follows an admission larger than either person quite expected. I was crying by then, and I told her I forgave her, and we sat together for a long while, and before she left, she asked, quietly, whether she might apologize to Casey directly as well, because she said she did not want the woman standing at the front of that baptistry to carry any part of the coldness she herself had once helped create around this friendship. I told her that was entirely her decision to make, and that Casey, in my experience, was far more gracious about the whole 2 years than either of us probably deserved. Casey was baptized 3 weeks ago, and Marilyn stood at the edge of that baptistry, helping steady her the way the older women at Grace Community traditionally do for anyone being baptized, her own eyes wet through the entire brief ceremony. Afterward, in the fellowship hall, Marilyn found Casey directly and told her, plainly, that she had once considered her friendship with me a spiritual risk, and that she had never been more grateful to be wrong about anything in her whole life. I watched that particular exchange from a few feet away, holding a paper plate of cake I had not yet touched, and I remember thinking that I had spent 2 years imagining what vindication might feel like if it ever actually arrived, and that the reality of it was quieter and warmer than anything I had pictured, simply two women I loved finally standing in the same room without any distance left between them. Here is where everyone stands now. Casey attends Grace Community every week now, has joined the same small group I once led, and tells anyone who asks that she came to faith not through an argument anyone ever won against her doubts, but through watching an ordinary friendship refuse to bend under 2 years of pressure from people who should have celebrated it instead of suspecting it. Marilyn and I have rebuilt something over these past months that I did not expect to ever have with her again. Careful, honest conversations over coffee, where she asks me real questions now about how Casey is doing in her own faith, genuinely curious rather than evaluating. Ruth Ann told me recently that watching Marilyn finally soften was one of the quiet joys of her own long friendship with her, having spent 2 years gently disagreeing with a woman she respected without ever once expecting to see her change so completely. Deborah, of everyone in that small group, apologized to me privately as well, some weeks after Casey's baptism, telling me she had thought often, since witnessing the ceremony, about her own comment on that Sunday morning after my move, and that she had come to understand the difference between praising someone's kindness and reducing them to a category, a distinction she said she wished she had understood 2 years earlier. Deborah told me, that same conversation, that she had actually attended the baptism somewhat reluctantly, expecting to feel awkward or unconvinced, and that watching Casey come up out of that water, crying openly, had undone something in her she had not anticipated, a plain, visible joy that did not match any of the careful reservations she had carried about the friendship for 2 full years. She said she had cried through most of the reception afterward, not entirely sure herself whether the tears were for Casey or for her own 2 years of quiet unkindness she was only now beginning to fully reckon with. A few of our fellow teachers at school, who had watched the friendship between Casey and me from a distance without knowing much of the church tension underneath it, told me, once they finally heard the full story from Casey herself, that they found the whole thing remarkable in a way that surprised them, several of them not particularly religious themselves. One coworker, a science teacher named Priya, who describes herself as thoroughly secular, told me she had always assumed church friendships came with an invisible asterisk, conditional on eventually bringing someone around to belief, and that hearing how patiently I had loved Casey without ever once making the friendship transactional had changed, at least slightly, her own assumptions about what genuine faith actually looked like in practice. Priya told me, too, that she had watched Casey's own transformation over that final year, with something bordering on suspicion at first, wondering whether grief had simply made her vulnerable to persuasion she would not have accepted under ordinary circumstances, and that it was only after watching Casey continue to ask hard, honest questions well past any obvious emotional vulnerability that Priya had come to believe the change was genuine, rather than merely circumstantial. My own parents, who had watched the whole 2 years unfold from a slight distance, told me they had never once doubted my judgment about the friendship, though they admitted they had wondered, privately, whether the pressure from my small group would eventually wear me down regardless of who was actually right about it. My father told me he was prouder of how I had handled those 2 years than almost anything else he had watched me do in my adult life, not because I had won an argument, but because I had simply refused to let anyone else's fear decide who I was allowed to love. I remember that particular conversation with my father clearly, sitting on his own back porch a few weeks after Casey's baptism, both of us watching the evening settle over his yard the way we had done countless times growing up. He told me he had served as a deacon at Grace Community for 15 years and had watched more than one good friendship quietly wither under exactly the kind of pressure I had faced. People who simply did not have the particular stubbornness required to outlast 2 years of suspicion from their own community. He said he had prayed for me nearly every week of those 2 years, not that the pressure would lift, but that I would have the strength to keep loving Casey, regardless of whether it ever did. He told me, too, that he had considered saying something to Marilyn directly, more than once, as a fellow leader in that same congregation, and had held back each time, uncertain whether intervening on my behalf might make the situation harder for me rather than easier. I told him I was glad he had held back, that I believed, looking back now, the story needed to unfold the slow way it did, without any shortcut either of us might have tried to build for it. I want to leave you with what I have come to believe was the actual center of this whole story. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of it right now, suspected by your own faith community for loving someone who does not yet believe. I have thought, more than once, about how many friendships like this one probably never make it to any kind of resolution at all, quietly worn down by exactly the pressure I nearly gave in to myself. And I do not tell this story to suggest every hard friendship inside a church community ends this cleanly. I only know that mine did, and that I would not trade the way it happened for any easier version of the same ending. You cannot argue your way past someone else's fear, and you cannot force a crisis to arrive on a convenient schedule to prove your patience was worth something. What you can do, the only thing I ever actually did across 2 years, was keep loving your friend exactly the same way, without resentment toward the people questioning you, without demanding they see the friendship clearly before they were ready to. I did not know for 2 years whether Casey would ever come to faith or whether Marilyn would ever soften. I only knew that I still intended to love my friend exactly the way I already did, whether my own church was watching closely enough to understand it or not. And it turned out, in the end, that steady, unremarkable love was the only argument that was ever actually going to reach either one of them. I think often about how close this story came to never reaching this particular ending. If I had given in to the pressure during that second year, the way some part of me genuinely wanted to more than once, and quietly let the friendship cool the way it would have been so easy to do, I do not know that Casey would have had anyone steady enough beside her the exact week her mother died. I do not say that to suggest the outcome was owed to me, because it was not, and Diane's death was a real and devastating loss that cost Casey something none of us would ever wish on anyone. I say it only because I think it is worth being honest that some walls do not come down through patience alone. Sometimes they require a crisis neither side would ever have chosen, arriving at exactly the moment it was needed, whether either of us was ready for it or not. I have come to believe that the 2 years of quiet suspicion were never actually wasted, even though they felt, at the time, like a slow, ongoing loss with no end in sight. Every morning I prayed for women who had grown cold toward me. Every Sunday I showed up despite the distance. Every ordinary coffee with Casey where I simply loved her without any agenda attached was its own small act of faithfulness, building, without my fully realizing it, toward a moment none of us could have predicted or planned for. Faithfulness rarely announces which particular ordinary Tuesday it is actually preparing you for. It simply asks you to keep showing up, one hard Sunday at a time, until the day finally arrives that needs exactly the person you have quietly been all along. I think often about how differently this story might read if Diane had not died when she did, if Casey's own crisis had never arrived to make plain what 2 years of ordinary friendship had already been quietly building. I do not know how many more years I might have carried that particular tension inside my own church without ever seeing it resolved, and I do not say that to suggest the outcome was somehow owed to me, because grief of that magnitude is never a fair price for anyone to pay, even in service of an ending this good. I say it only because I think it is worth being honest, that some walls do not come down through patience alone. Sometimes they require a crisis neither side would ever have chosen, arriving at exactly the moment it was needed, whether either of us was ready for it or not. I think, too, about the woman I became across those 2 years, and I do not say this with any pride, only with a kind of quiet astonishment when I look back at who I was the evening Marilyn first made that comment in small group. Still certain, in the naive way you are certain when something first wounds you, that a simple clarifying conversation would settle the misunderstanding once and for all. It did not settle anything, not for a long while, and I had to learn a harder, slower patience than I ever expected my own church family would ask of me, the kind that does not announce itself as growth while it is happening, and only reveals its shape much later, at a graveside, watching a friend ask an honest question she had never once been ready to ask before. I do not think I could have explained that particular kind of patience to the woman I was that first Wednesday evening, sitting in a small group circle, replaying a sentence aimed at me without ever using my name. Some things simply have to be lived through slowly, one difficult Sunday at a time, before they can be understood at all, and I have come to believe that is exactly as it should be, since a patience learned too easily rarely holds up under the specific weight that actually tests it. That is my story. 2 years, one sudden death, one quiet friendship that refused to bend, and a wall inside my own church that came down not because I argued it down, but because the very thing it warned against became the clearest evidence of grace any of us had witnessed in years. I think, in the end, about those 2 coffee mugs I asked you to remember at the very start of this story, sitting side by side, on my own porch railing, in every kind of weather. Casey's mug used to sit there because she was my friend who did not believe. It sits there now because she is my sister in Christ, who happens to still like her coffee exactly the same way she always did, and I have decided that small, unremarkable continuity is the truest picture I know of how this whole story actually ended. Nothing about our friendship needing to change at all, except everything underneath it. I asked Casey once, recently, whether she ever resents the 2 years it took, whether some part of her wishes she had come to faith sooner, before her mother's death, before either of us had to walk through that particular grief at all. She thought about it for a long moment before answering, and then she told me she did not think she would trade the timing even if she could, because she was not certain the faith she found afterward would have taken root nearly as honestly if it had arrived on any easier or more convenient schedule. She said she had come to believe that some truths simply cannot be rushed toward, no matter how much everyone around them might wish otherwise, and that she was grateful, now, for every slow month it actually took her to arrive. I still attend Grace Community every week now, sitting in that same pew third from the front, and Casey sits beside me most Sundays, her own faith no longer new enough to feel fragile, simply another ordinary part of the rhythm of our lives together, the way faith is meant to settle eventually into the plain furniture of an actual friendship, rather than remaining forever a subject either of us needs to carefully navigate. If you have ever been suspected by your own church for a friendship that never once threatened your faith, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, because I believe there are far more of us than anybody around us realizes. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear that steady, patient love is still doing more work than it feels like most days, and if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.